In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create realistic fire and smoke simulations for beginners. So if you've never used fire and smoke simulations before in Blender, I'll be covering all the basics and going over all the basic settings to create a realistic fire simulation. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase the tutorial project files, you can get the project files with the links in the video description. And if you enjoy my videos and you'd like to help support the channel monthly, a great way to do that is joining my Patreon page. So if you join one of my Patreon memberships, you'll get access to lots of Blender content like tutorial project files, and you'll be helping to support the channel monthly. So here I am in a new scene in Blender. I'll have my screencast keys right here in the corner so you can see what buttons I'm pressing. So I'm just going to start by selecting everything and we're going to delete everything. So when you're doing a fire or smoke simulation, you need to add two different objects. One object is going to be where the fire is emitting out of, and then the other object is a domain which the fire is going to simulate in. So we'll go to the add menu. I'm just going to go here to mesh, and I'm just going to add an icosphere. And then I'm going to scale the icosphere down, and I'll type 0.2, and then I'll press Ctrl A and apply the scale so it's a bit smaller. That's a better size when modeling to the real life scale in Blender. So we're going to have the fire be emitting out of this object. So then we also need to add another domain object where the fire is going to simulate inside that object. So I'll go to the add menu, I'm going to add a cube, and I'm going to hold down the Z button and I'll go to wireframe view, and in edit mode I'm going to bring the cube up, and then also if I go to the face select and select the top face, I can just bring the top face up. So the fire is only going to simulate in the size of the cube. And generally it's best to keep the cube as small as you can, because if the cube is really big, the simulation will take longer to simulate because it has a lot more space. So we'll select the icosphere, and then we're going to click right over here to go to the physics properties. Now you can see right here there isn't any button for fire and smoke, and so we actually need to choose fluid, and then on the fluid type we'll be able to choose fire instead of liquid. So here on the fluid type you can click right here, and there's a few different ones here. There's domain, flow, and effector. For this one here, for this object, we want to choose flow because this is where the fire is going to flow out of. And then right here you can see on the flow type we can choose between liquid or fire and smoke. We'll select the next object now, and we're also going to add the fluid physics. Now this is going to be the domain, so this is where the fire is going to simulate inside the cube. So on the type here, we want to change it to domain, not flow. So choose domain. Now, if you happen to use Blender for video editing like I do, then you might have this playback setting turned on. So if I just open this up, bring this up bigger, you can see on the timeline, if I click on playback, and you can see there is a sync here. Because I do video editing in Blender, I have this set to sync to audio. But when you're doing simulations in Blender, it's a lot better to be able to see every frame. So I just keep this at play every frame. So just make sure it's set to play every frame. So I'm going to press the space bar to play the animation. And you can see there's a little puff of smoke. So there's a few problems with this. For one thing, we can't actually see any fire, we can just see smoke, and then also it isn't continuing to flow. There's basically just one puff of smoke and then it disappears. So first what we're going to do is we're going to select the icosphere, and we're going to go here to the flow type. And here on smoke, instead of smoke, we can choose between fire or fire and smoke. Now, if you change it to fire and smoke and then go back to the start and play this, you can see there's a little puff of fire, but then it goes away. And then here on the fire, if I just change it to fire, you can see there is going to be a little bit of smoke, but there's a lot less. So if you want to have more like smoldering flames, and if you want there to be a lot more smoke, you can choose fire and smoke. However, I just want a little bit of smoke because I mostly just want it to be fire, so I'm going to choose fire. So choose fire and smoke if you want a lot more smoke, or just choose fire if you want very little smoke. Now if you pause the animation and then try going into the rendered view or try rendering this, you can see the fire isn't actually there, and that's because this fire here and the smoke that you can see is just a preview in the viewport. So later in the video we're going to be setting up a material for the fire, but just for now that is just going to be a preview in the viewport. It's normal that you can't see any fire in the render. Now I want there to be continuous fire, sort of like if this were a fire pit. So to fix this, we're going to go to this flow behavior. Now on default, it's set to geometry, and so the geometry is just going to create fire depending on the object's geometry. So for example, if I have like a really big icosphere, there's going to be a big flame which is coming up, but it's only going to make as much fire as the size of the geometry. So because I want continuous fire, we're going to click on the flow behavior, and we're going to change it to inflow instead. This way, if I play the animation here by hitting the spacebar on the timeline, you can see there's just continuous fire. So now it looks like fire flowing from an outside campfire. Now there was also another one here which was called outflow. So if I duplicate the icosphere and bring it up here, and then on the flow behavior, I'm going to change this to outflow. This is going to remove fire which touches it. So I'm just going to scale this up, stick it right here. Now if I go back to the starting and play this, you can see fire is going to disappear when it hits that object. So if you want the fire to disappear, you can add another object and change it to outflow, but I'm just going to delete this object. Now you can see that sometimes the simulation will update. You can kind of see the fire still disappeared. So you can go back to the starting and then play it again, and that might fix it. Another thing you can do is just slightly move the object, kind of drag the object over, and then if you play it again, that should fix the simulation there in the viewport. Now I wanted to show you how to set up the fire manually. However, there is a way to create a quick smoke effect. So if I just go to the add menu and add another icosphere, I'll just scale this down and bring it over here. With this object selected, I can click on object and I can go here to quick effects, and there's a few different quick effects here like fur, explode, and a few different more ones. I'm going to choose the quick smoke. And so what this is going to do is going to create a domain, and it's going to add this object and then add smoke coming out of it. So this is a much quicker way to quickly set up a fire simulation. So it's pretty much done everything that we've done here in this simulation. So if you want to just do that in the future, you can just add an object, and then you can just go to object, quick effects, and you can add quick smoke. So now let's go over the different settings to change the look of the fire. So we're going to select the icosphere again. So we already talked about the flow type. So you can choose between smoke, fire, or fire and smoke. I'm going to leave it at fire. And then we already talked about the flow behavior. So inflow, outflow, and geometry. But for this object, we're going to use outflow, so it flows out fire. Now there's also this check mark here called used flow. So if I turn this off, go back to the starting and play this, you can see there is no fire, or if I turn it back on, you can see the fire is going to start. So this is great for if you want to have like the fire be delayed. So let's say you didn't want the fire to start until frame 60. So what I could do is go one frame back, I can turn this off, and then what I can do is hit the I key with my mouse hovered over that value. It's going to add a keyframe. Then if I go one frame over by hitting the arrow key, I can click to turn it on and then hit the I key to add another keyframe. You can now see there's 2 keyframes in the timeline. So if I play this, that's going to delay the animation. So now if I play this, the fire starts. And then what I could do is hit the I key, go one frame over, turn it off, and then hit the I key again. So now you can see it starts at frame 60, and then you can see it'll just start and the fire will just go out. So this is a great way to animate the fire. But I'm just going to select the keyframes and just delete the keyframes, and I'll turn the use flow back on. So you can use the use flow just to animate the fire turning on and off. Now the sampling substeps is going to improve the quality of the fire. However, if you turn this up too high, it might start to get kind of laggy. You can see it doesn't look too bad, but it is definitely a bit more laggy. However, I'm just going to keep this down to 0. I don't really want to turn up this value, but if you find it's a bit low quality and you want to improve it, you can turn that up. Now, as far as the general quality and the detail of the smoke, we're going to be adding a lot more detail later. You can see it's really blobby right now, so we'll be adding that later. We'll be adding more detail to it later in the video. Now, there's also this absolute density. So if I turn this off and then play this, you can see more and more smoke is just going to continue to build up. So this makes like a really large fire simulation. This might be good for like an explosion or like a large house that's on fire or something. But if you turn the absolute density on and then play this, you can see it's going to be more natural, looks more like a campfire. And so the smoke is going to dissipate and then go away, and then more smoke will replace it. Now the fuel is going to fuel the fire. So if you turn this up, there's going to be a lot more flames. So you can see if I turn this up all the way to 5 on the fuel, there's going to be a very large simulation. Or if I turn this down maybe to like a 0.2 and then go back to the starting and play this, it's going to be a very small simulation. What I'm going to do is turn this to like a 0.6. So now when I go back to the starting and play this, you can see the simulation is just a little bit smaller, and I like that a bit better. So the fuel is going to add more fuel to the fire. So it's like you're adding more logs to the fire and making a much larger fire. Now there's also this vertex group here, and so you can create a vertex group on an object, and then the fire is only going to come out of that area. So let me just go into edit mode, and what I'm going to do is go to the face select, and I'm just going to select these 2 faces. I'm now going to click right over here to go to the object data properties, and I'm going to open up the vertex groups. I'll click on the plus here to create a new group. You can rename the group if you want to, but then I'm going to click on the assign button, and that's just going to assign those faces to that vertex group. Now what I'm going to do is go back here to the physics settings, and here on the vertex group, I can choose the group that we added. And now when I play this, you can see it's just coming out on this corner because it's only emitting out of those faces. But I'm just going to delete this because I want it to come out the entire thing. But if you have maybe like a ground plane or some kind of object, and you just want to have the flames coming out of little bits, like maybe you have a log which is on fire, you can just assign the vertex group to different parts of the log or the object. And then the fire will only come out from those faces. Now there's also the flow source here, so I'll open this up, and there's two main settings. There is a mesh and there's particle system. So with mesh, it's just going to emit the flames out of the object's mesh. However, if I change this to particle system, it's going to be emitted out of the particles. And so let me just show you real quick. You don't have to follow along with this, but you can if you want to. I'm going to go to the particles here. I'm going to click on new to add new particle settings. And then if I play this, you can see particles are coming out, and I'm just going to bring this up here so the particles kind of fall down into the domain. And then what I want to do is go back to the physics, and here on the flow source, we set this to particle system, and then we can just choose the particle system that we added. Now, if I play this, you can see that there's going to be fire coming out of the particles. So let me just scale up the domain object, make it really big. So now you can see it's like almost like there's a bunch of little fireballs or something which are coming out there, because every single one of the particles is going to be emitting fire. So you could definitely get some really cool effects with this, especially if you turn up the quality. It looks kind of blobby right now, but if you turn up the quality, it could look really cool. But what I'm going to do is just select this object, and I'm going to delete the particle system. Let's just bring this down here, go back to the starting, and I'm going to bring the domain here back to the original size and just bring this down here. So we're just back to where we started before. And if we select the icosphere, go here to the flow source, I'm going to change this back to mesh. So the fire is just emitted out of the mesh of the object. Now there's another cool option here called initial velocity. So I can turn on the initial velocity, and we can basically make the fire shoot out in one direction. So for example, there is the normal. So if I turn up the normal, let's just turn this up to like a 1. I need to make it a little bit stronger. So I'll turn this up to like a 20, and I'll bring the icosphere up here. So now when I play this, you can see the fire is coming out of the direction of the normals. So the normals are the direction that the face is pointing. So you can see the flames are kind of coming out at all these different angles. Or let's say I wanted the fire to shoot out on the x-axis. So here on the initial velocity, I could turn the x-axis here to maybe like a 20. You can see it's now shooting out on this side. It's shooting out along the x-axis because we turned the initial velocity to 20 here on the x. So this would be a really great way to create like a flamethrower, or maybe like a rocket launch if you want to have a flame coming out of the bottom of a rocket. But let me just bring this back into the center, and I'll just turn the initial velocity back to 0, and I can just turn off this setting. Now at the very bottom here, there is a texture setting. So I can turn on the texture setting. I'll just check mark this. And so you can actually add a texture, and then different parts of the mesh where the texture is going to have the flames coming out more in some areas and less in other areas. So you can choose a texture here. So first let's click right over here to go to the texturing workspace. We'll add a new texture, and on image or movie here, I could change it to a few different ones. Let's choose like the Musgrave. And then if you just click right back here to go to the physics, scroll down, make sure you've chosen that texture. You can see added it automatically. So if I play the simulation, let's go back to the fire settings. You can see because I've added this Musgrave texture, the fire looks a little bit more natural, and it kind of has a little bit more variation. The lighter parts of the texture means that there's going to be more fire, and then the black parts means that there's going to be less fire. So you could change the different types here, like let's try clouds. You can kind of see how clouds look. So you can see the flames just look a lot more random. So what I'm going to do is change it to Musgrave. I think Musgrave looks really nice. And then another thing you could do if you want to is go down here to colors, and you could turn up the contrast. So if I turn up the contrast, now there's clear areas where it's black and white, and it just makes it even more contrasted. Now I'm going to click back here to go to the physics settings, and there's a few more settings you could play around with. So there's a scale and an offset. So we have the size here. So if I turn this up maybe to like a 20, you can kind of see the texture is now a bit larger, or I could make it really small, like a 0.1 or something. Now I'm finding that the contrast is adding way too much fire. So if I go back here to the texture panel, I'm going to turn the contrast back to the default of 1, and then we'll just play the animation. And that looks a lot better because there was a bit too much fire. Now back over here on the physics settings, you can actually animate the offset to make the flame look a bit more natural, because you can actually move the offset of the texture. So I'm going to do that. So here on the end frame, I'm going to set this to 150. I'm just going to have it be a short animation of 150 frames because fire simulations do take a long time to render. So what I'm going to do is go to frame 0, and I'm going to hit the I key with my mouse hovered over the offset. Then I'm going to go to just a little bit past the very end, and then I can type in maybe an offset of like 20, and then hit the I key to add a new keyframe. And then here in the timeline, let's select everything. We're going to hit the T key, and we're going to change the type here to linear so it moves at a consistent speed. So now I can kind of play this, and that should just add a bit more variation to the flames. And then if I zoom in here, you can see the flames are kind of like wobbling a lot. That's because the offset is moving. So what I might want to do is hit the A key to select the keyframes, and I might want to scale the keyframes up just so that offset, the offset moves quite a bit slower. So now you can see it doesn't look quite as wobbly. It just kind of moves up and down just a little bit. So that makes it look a bit more natural. Now you can also make the fire collide with objects. So I'm going to go to the add menu and I'm just going to add a cube and I'll bring the cube up. Let's go into edit mode and I think I will scale it down. Just kind of make like a slab right there. We'll just stick it on top of the fire. So now what we're going to do on the new cube object is we're going to add fluid, but then here on the type, we're going to change it to effector instead. So now if I go back to the start and play this, you can see the fire is trying to go around the cube that we added. So this would be really useful if you have like a brick wall or a burning building or something, and you want the fire to interact with other objects in the scene. Now something else that you might want to do, let me just delete this object first. Something else that you might want to do is hide this object from the viewport, because maybe you just want to have this object emit the flames, but you want to have like a campfire or have some other objects, and you don't actually want to see the icosphere. Well, to do that, you can hide it from the render. So what you can do is click over here to go to the object properties, and you can open up the visibility, and then you can see there is show in viewports and show in renders. So if I just disable the renders, then if I were to render the scene, this icosphere would be invisible. But for the demonstration of this video, I'm going to keep it turned back on so you'll be able to see the icosphere. Alright, so we've gone over the main settings of the flow object. Let's now click on the domain object and we have more settings on the domain object. Select the domain and we're going to click back here to go to the physics properties. Now I did mention this earlier, but what you want to do is make sure that this object is just as big as you need it. Because if this object is really large, then there's going to be more space that Blender has to simulate, and so the simulation is going to take longer. So just make sure this object is just big enough to fit the simulation. Now on the domain type, you can see there's liquid and gas. The liquid is if you're doing a fluid simulation, but we're going to leave it as gas for the fire. Now right here we have this resolution division, and this is the main setting to adjust the quality of the simulation. So for example, if I turn this up to like a 200, so it's really high quality, now if I play this, you can see it's going to be very laggy in the viewport, but you can see how much higher quality this is. If I kind of zoom in here, you can see it's way more detailed. So maybe for the resolution divisions, just for now, I might turn it to like a 60. So if I play this, it's definitely going to be higher resolution, but it's still a bit low quality. But later on in the video, before we bake this, we're going to turn the resolution divisions much higher. Now there's also a time scale setting, and this is simply going to change the speed of the animation. So 1 is probably pretty good for most fire simulations, but if you find it's a bit slow, you could maybe turn it up to a 1.2 or a 1.5. You can see if I turn this up pretty high, just play this again, the fire is going to be really fast. Or if you want to do like a slow motion video, I could turn it to like a 0.2 and the fire is going to be much slower. I'm just going to keep the time scale at 1 because that's the default. Now there's also the border collisions, and so with this, the border is going to interact with the fire. So right now if I just play this, you can see the flames just disappear when they get to the very top. However, let's turn on the border collisions front. So if I turn this on and play this again, you can see the smoke isn't going to disappear, it's kind of going to stay right up here. But I'm going to keep these settings turned off because I don't really want the fire to interact with the edges of the domain. Now there's another useful setting called the adaptive domain. So if I turn this on, you can see the domain is actually going to change size depending on the size of the animation. So this can be very useful for making it not quite as laggy, because when the fire is smaller, the domain is going to be smaller, but then when it gets larger, it's going to eventually get to the size that you've created it. So in edit mode, whatever size you've made, but then once it gets to that size, it's not going to get any larger. So I'm going to leave this turned on, so that should help the simulation speed just to be a bit faster. Now under the gas settings, there is a buoyancy density. So if I turn the buoyancy density up, it's going to make the fire rise faster. And you can also turn the heat up as well. So if I turn up the buoyancy and the heat, now if I play this, you can see the smoke rises quite a bit faster, and the smoke also looks a bit more crazy and abstract. But I'm going to keep these at the default of 1. Now there's also this vorticity setting, and this is going to make it act like a bit more windy and just make the smoke and fire a lot more crazy. So let me turn this up to a much larger value. So if I turn this up to like a 4, you can see it's going to be really crazy. That is of course way too big. Let me just turn it to a small value, maybe just like a 0.5. Now if I play it, you can see the smoke definitely is going to be a little bit more crazy, but it's not too crazy. But I'm going to keep the vorticity back to 0. Now we can also turn up the dissolve setting, and this will make the smoke either last longer or disappear faster. So if I turn the time to 1, you can see the fire is disappearing very fast. So this might be a good way to create like a little fireball or a glowing orb. Let's turn it up to a bit larger. Now you can see a time of 8, the fire is definitely going to last a bit longer and the smoke will last a bit longer. So you can use the dissolve to just make the smoke disappear quicker. I'm going to turn off the dissolve though because I don't want to use it. Now there's also this cool noise feature, so if I turn this on, this is going to add a bit of noise to the edges, so you can see it looks a lot more detailed now. Now I find that this can actually make it a little bit too noisy, and it might look a bit unrealistic. Maybe this would be better for like a really large detailed explosion if you want to create kind of like an explosion, but I think for an object like this, it's a little bit too detailed, but you can definitely turn this on if you want to add a bit more detail to the fire. And there's a few different settings, like you can change the strength of the noise and the scale of the noise, but I'm going to leave it turned off, but that is a very useful setting to know. Let's open up this fire tab right here, and there's this reaction speed, and this is going to make the flames last longer. So if I turn this to a very small value, like a 0.1, you can see the flames are going to last a lot longer, so there's almost like this big billowing pillar of flames. However, if I turn this up all the way to the max of 2 here, now if I play this, the fire is going to disappear quite a bit quicker. You can see the fire is already disappearing and it hasn't even gotten that high. And then here with the flame smoke, that is also going to add more and less of the smoke. And with the temperature maximum and temperature minimum, this is going to make the fire flow up faster. Now there's also this collections tab, and this can be useful if you have lots of different objects and you want to manage them better. So for example, I have these 2 icospheres and I put them in collection 1. Then I have these 2 icospheres and I put them in collection 2. So if I click on the domain again, let's go to the collections, and you can see there are different collections for flow and effector, which you can specify. So for example, I'll choose collection 1. And now when I play this, you can see the fire is only going to be emitting out of the object which are in collection 1, and I also did add the flow to both of these objects. However, if I wanted to change this, I could go back down here, change it to collection 2 instead, and now it would just use the other 2 objects. So this can be useful if you have a lot of different objects and you just want to manage them better in your scene. Now the cache tab is used to bake the simulation, and we're going to be going back to this later in the video, but I want to do this towards the end. So I'm now going to jump down to field weights. So with the field weights, you can manage the different force fields and the gravity. So if you want to disable the gravity or disable any of the forces, you can turn them down. So for example, I'll go to the add menu. You can go down here to force field, and I could add a wind. So let's just rotate the wind, maybe scale it down and stick it right over here. And then I can turn up the wind strength. You can see those circles there are going to show how strong the wind is. Maybe I'll just turn the strength down though to like a 10, so it's not quite as strong. Now if I click back on the domain and scroll down to the bottom and go to the field weights, I could make it less strong. So for example, let's go down here to wind, and I can just drag the wind down, turn it down to like a 0.1 or a 0.2, and I can see it's not really going to affect the fire that much because the wind is a lot less strong, or I can turn this up and the wind is going to have its full effect. So I'm just going to delete this wind object now. So now we're going to go back up here to the cache, and we can use the cache to bake the simulation. So if I just play this in the viewport, it's really laggy, and especially if I turn the quality up, it would just be way too laggy in the viewport, so it would be hard to actually see what the simulation is going to look like. Now on the cache type, you have 3 different options. Replay is the one that we've been using, and this will just play it in real time as we are playing the simulation. So this is good at the very starting when you just want to adjust the rough settings. If I change the type to modular, you can bake simulations individually. So for example, if I turn on this noise here, you can see the noise actually has a noise which I can bake. So I could bake the noise separately. First though, I'd have to go back up to the very top here and I have to bake the simulation, and then I could go down here and bake the noise. I'm going to keep the noise turned off though. So you can use the modular if you want to bake them separately. However, I'm going to go back to the cache here, and instead of modular, I'm going to choose all. And so this is going to bake all of the simulation at once. So you can see now when I try to play this in the viewport, it's not showing any fire because I haven't baked the simulation. So it's a good idea to save your project before you bake it. And also let's scroll right up here, and I'm going to change the resolution divisions. I'm going to make this a much higher value of 250. So it's a lot higher resolution. So this is going to look a lot higher quality, but it will also take longer to bake. Let's scroll down to the bottom here. I'll hit Control S to save, and then I'll turn the end frame here to 150. So you can choose the start frame of the bake and the end frame of the bake. So I'll turn it to 150 so that it bakes a little bit faster. And then we'll click on Bake All, and we can just wait for this to bake, and I'll come back when it's finished. So the simulation has finished baking, and you can see it's much higher quality now because we had it way down at like a 60 or a 30, but we now have the resolution at 120. So you can see it's a lot higher quality. Now, if you still think the quality looks a little bit low resolution, it is actually going to be higher resolution in the final render. So we can now jump over to the materials and create some cool materials, because if I go into the rendered view, we still can't actually see the smoke. So let's click right over here to go to the shading workspace. Now here on the render properties, I am going to be using the Cycles rendering engine because I'm going for realism. You can use Eevee if you want to, but I find that the fire and smoke simulations just aren't as high resolution and aren't as high quality. You can definitely do this in Eevee and the material will work the same in Eevee, but I'm going to be using Cycles. Now you want to add the material to the domain. You don't want to add the material to this object. You can add a different material to this object if you want to, but for the smoke material and the fire material, you need to select the domain. Let's click on new to add a new material, and I can just call this fire. And we'll go into the rendered viewport mode to see how this is looking. And I'm going to click over here on the world properties, and I'm just going to delete the world so it's fully black so we can really see the fire glowing. Now we don't want to use the principled shader because this is just going to be on the surface. We want to use the volume instead. So we're going to delete the principled shader. Let's go to the add menu and we're going to search for the principled volume. And because this is a volume, we're going to put it into the volume instead of the surface. You can see not that much has changed. Now one easy way that you can show the fire and the smoke is to turn up the black body intensity. So if I turn the black body intensity all the way up to 1, you can see the fire and the smoke. And you could turn up even higher to maybe like a 10, so the fire looks a lot brighter. Now there is something that I want to change regarding the color management. So if I click here on the render properties and scroll down here, let's open up the color management at the very bottom. And if I change the view transform from AGX, which is the default, I'm going to change it to filmic instead. You can see the colors look quite a bit more saturated. And then here on none, I'm going to change this to high contrast. So you can see here's the difference between AGX. The colors just don't look that nice. I think changing it to filmic definitely makes the colors look better. So I'm going to use filmic and I'll change the look to high contrast. So now you can also change this temperature value. So if you turn this up, you can see things are going to be a bit lighter and a bit blown out, or you can turn the temperature down if you want to be a bit more red. And maybe even I could even turn the black body intensity even higher to like a 20. So that's one way to create the fire material, but I'm going to be using a different method that I like better. So I'm going to move the principled volume up here, and I'm going to duplicate it and drop it down here. And I'm just going to plug the volume into the volume here. And then with the volume, principled volume selected, I'll hit the backspace, and that's going to reset it. So what I'm going to do instead is search for volume info. Let's drop the volume info right here. And I can now take the flame and I can put the flame into the emission strength. If I were just to turn the emission strength up, you can just see it looks really blocky and that doesn't look good. But if I put the flame into the emission strength, now that looks a lot nicer and more detailed. I can also take the flame and put the flame into the emission color to adjust the colors. Now I want to change the colors. So if I go to the add menu, I can search for a color ramp and I'll drop the color ramp here between the volume info and the emission color. So this way we can customize the color of the flames. So that's one reason why I like this method better. So what I'm going to do is hold down the control key and click here in the middle to add a tab. And then for this tab, I'm going to make it like a bright red. And then for this color here, I'm going to make it kind of like a bright yellow orange. And then you could also keep this one as black. You could change this color if you want to. You can see if I turn it up a little bit, it kind of adds like a lighter bit on the edges, but I'm going to keep this as black. You could also like drag this over here and add another tab and make this one a little bit more white. So maybe I'll do that, make this like a really light color, maybe like a bright yellow. Now the fire doesn't look really bright, and so we need to make the emission strength stronger. If, for example, I just drop a color ramp here and then just drag this white out, you can see there is more white, so it does look slightly brighter, but this isn't actually making the fire brighter. And that's because this color ramp just has a black value, which is 0, and a white value, which is 1. I'm going to hit Control X to delete the color ramp. So what I'm going to do instead is add a math node, and I'm going to drop the math node between the flame and the emission strength, and we can turn up the value, and this is going to make a value brighter than 1. So if I turn this up more and more, now you can see the fire looks much brighter. So I'm going to turn this value to like a 30, so it's quite a bit brighter. And then you might want to change the colors, kind of play around with the colors. Now you can't really see the smoke that well, so what we're going to do is turn up this density value so you'll be able to see more of the smoke. So you can see if I turn this up to a pretty big value, now the smoke is really dense. I'm just going to turn the density to a 10 here so you can see just a little bit of the smoke. Now it's still pretty hard to see, so to fix this, I'm going to go here to light on the add menu and I'm going to choose a sunlight, and I'll bring the sunlight up here and I'll just rotate it over. And then here on the side panel, I'll just turn the sunlight settings maybe up to like a 5 or even up to like a 10. And now you can see that smoke a lot better. So if I click back on the domain to go to the settings, you can see now if I change the density here, that's going to make the smoke a lot more thick. So if you want like really thick smoke, kind of like that, you could turn this way up. I'm just going to keep it to maybe like a 5 or maybe like a 10. So the smoke is just a little bit visible. So we are just about ready to render this. Let's click back here to go to the layout, and I'll go to the add menu and I will add a camera, and I'll move my view right about here and hit Control Alt Numpad 0 to bring the camera to my view. And if I click right over here to go to the output properties, I'm going to change the resolution X and Y both to 1920 by 1920. So it's a square image. And then I might just move this in here, something like that. Now, another very important setting to make the fire look a lot more realistic and add a lot more detail is to turn on the motion blur. So I'll throw up 2 images here on the screen. Here is the same exact render, but with the motion blur turned off. And here's the other render with the motion blur turned on. So turning on the motion blur is super effective for making the smoke look much more detailed. So I'd highly recommend turning on the motion blur. It will make the scene longer to render, but it makes the smoke look so much better. So I'm definitely going to be turning on that motion blur. Let's open up the sampling here, and on the samples here for this scene, I find that you can just use a very small samples. So I'm going to change the samples to 20 here on the render samples. And then I'm also going to turn on the render denoise so it denoises the image so there won't be quite as much noise. Now I also want to add just a very small glow in the compositor. So let's click here to go to the compositor. Let's click on use nodes, and I can go to the add menu and I can search for the glare node. Drop this here. I can also just search for a viewer node. We can put the image up to the viewer just like that, so we can preview it in the background when we render it. So let's just give this a test render by hitting F12 to render. And once the render's finished, I'll just hit escape and that'll go back to the compositor. I'm going to hit the M key just to mute that node. And I want to show you something with the quality. So if I go right down here, you can see right here, there's kind of like these little pixelated areas where it kind of looks like there's little steps. And so this is the resolution. So that main resolution setting that I talked about, if you don't like how this is, then you'll need to turn up the resolution higher. But the smoke simulation looks pretty good in the rest of the scene. It just looks maybe slightly low quality down there. So I'm going to keep it at 250. Now if I select the glare and hit the M key to unmute it, let's just drag this out of the way so I can see how it looks. And for the glare type, I find that fog glow looks pretty good. If you change this to bloom, it's going to be way too strong and I just don't like how that looks. It doesn't look like fire. Now you could turn the threshold up to make it like less strong, but it's still just going to have like this big blob of glow and I really don't like that. So I find that changing it to fog glow works the best. So it's just going to be a very subtle glow. I'm also going to turn the threshold down to 0 because I find that just makes the entire thing a little bit more glowing, or you could even turn the threshold up to a small value of like a 0.2. And then you could also turn the size down if you don't want it to be quite as big. And you can also change the quality, so you could use high quality. That'll make it a little bit smaller, but higher quality. I'm just going to leave it at medium, and I might turn the size down just a little bit, maybe a 7 or an 8. I don't want it to be too strong, so maybe I'll just leave it at a 7. So now we can render all the frames to a folder. So what we're going to do is go here to the output properties. Let's go down here to the output, and we'll click on this file icon. Then you can just make a new folder. I'm just going to call it frames, and I'll just go into this folder and click on the accept button. So it's going to render out all the frames to that folder. And then here on the file format, you could use PNG or JPEG. And then once we render out all the frames, we'll be compiling them together in the video editor. So I'll just hit Control S to save this, and then you can click on render, and you can click on render animation. So once all the frames have finished rendering, you can open up a new Blender scene, and you can click on file, you can click on new, and you can open up new video editing. And here in Blender's video editor, let's hit Shift A for the add menu, and we'll go to image and sequence. And you can just locate to the folder where you saved all the rendered frames. I'll hit the A key to select the frames, and we'll click on add image strip. And then what you can do is you can select the strip of frames, and you can click on strip, and you can go down here and choose set render size. So that'll set it to the render size. You can also change the resolution right here manually if you want, and you can change the frame rate, but I left it at the default of 24. And then you can play the final animation. So then you could add like sound effects or whatever you want to do. And then to render this out to a final video, you can go down here to the output. You can click on this file icon to choose an output. So I'll just save it to my desktop. I'm going to use FFmpeg video and open open up the encoding, and I'm going to use MPEG-4 as the container, so it will be an MP4 file. I'll use H.264, medium quality and good. And then here on the audio, you can use AAC for the audio codec. That's the one that I like to use if you have any audio. You can also set the end frame. So here on the very bottom corner, I'll set this to 150 because that's the end frame. So you can save the file if you want to, and then click on render and just render the final animated video. So that's how you can create fire and smoke simulations in Blender. So I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you enjoy my video tutorials and you'd like to help support me and this channel, a great way to do that is by joining my Patreon page. So if you join one of my Patreon memberships, then you'll be helping to support the channel each month, and you'll also get access to lots of Blender content like 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, and lots more Blender content. Or if you'd like to make a one-time purchase of one of my products, you can also check out my Gumroad store where I have the same content. And if you're interested in learning more about physics and simulations in Blender, then definitely check out my physics and simulation tutorial playlist. Link to that is in the description. And in that playlist, I cover a lot more simulations and physics in Blender, like rigid body physics, soft body physics, cloth physics, and lots more physics and simulation tutorials. And if you'd like to learn more basic fundamentals of Blender, then definitely check out my Blender Beginner Fundamentals tutorial playlist, where I have lots more beginner tutorials on specific tools and workflows in Blender, like lighting for beginners, compositing for beginners, 3D modeling for beginners, and lots more beginner tutorials. And one more video you might be interested in is my procedural fire material. So that's a procedural material which creates this really cool fire and smoke effect. So if you don't want to go through the entire process of creating a large simulation, if you'd rather just use a procedural material to create a fire flame effect, you can definitely check out that video. Again, link is in the description. So that'll wrap it up for this video. So I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching.